The warm spring breeze carried the scent of lilacs as Beatrice Haywood stood alone in the small wooden church at the edge of Cottonwood Springs. The year was 1876, and the 22-year-old mail-order bride had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston, Massachusetts, only to find herself abandoned at the altar by a man she'd never even met. "I'm afraid Mr. Richardson isn't coming, miss," the elderly preacher said gently, placing a sympathetic hand on her trembling shoulder. His ranch hand just arrived with this. He handed her a hastily scrawled note. Beatrice's gloved fingers shook as she unfolded the paper. The words blurred through her tears. "Found someone else. Sorry for the trouble." 6 words. That's all she was worth to Maxwell Richardson after months of correspondence and promises of a good life in Wyoming territory. 6 callous words that left her stranded in a frontier town where she knew no one, with barely enough money for a week at the local boarding house. The small gathering of curious townsfolk who'd come to witness the wedding began to disperse, whispering behind their hands. Beatrice clutched her small bouquet of wildflowers, the stems damp with her nervous sweat. The white dress she'd painstakingly sewn by candlelight over countless evenings now felt like a costume in a cruel farce. "What am I to do now?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Her family back east had made it clear there was no place for her to return. Her father's new wife had no interest in housing a spinster stepdaughter, and the modest inheritance from her mother had been spent on this journey and her trousseau. A deep voice from the back of the church broke through her spiraling thoughts. "I'll marry you right now." Beatrice turned, blinking through her tears, to see a tall figure silhouetted in the doorway. As he stepped forward, the light from the stained glass windows illuminated him. He wore a dust-covered trail coat, worn boots, and a Stetson held respectfully in his hands. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with kind eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners. He couldn't have been more than 30. "I beg your pardon?" Beatrice managed, wondering if grief had caused her to hallucinate. The man stepped closer, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floor. "Name's Henry Foster, madam. I own the Double F Ranch about 10 miles north of town." He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with all the eyes now turned in his direction. "I couldn't help overhearing your predicament. I've been looking for a wife myself. Just haven't had the time to send away for one." The preacher stepped forward. "Now, Henry, this isn't exactly—" "I know it ain't proper, Reverend," Henry interrupted, his eyes never leaving Beatrice's face. "But neither is leaving a lady stranded with no prospects in a strange town. I'm offering a legitimate marriage. My ranch is doing well. I can provide a good home." Beatrice studied him, her heart pounding in her chest. He was handsome in a rugged way, with honest eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. But marry a complete stranger on the spot? Then again, wasn't that exactly what she'd been prepared to do with Maxwell Richardson? "Mr. Foster, while I appreciate your unconventional offer, I couldn't possibly—" "Miss Haywood," he said, somehow knowing her name, though they'd never been introduced. "I understand your hesitation. But Wyoming winters are harsh, and Cottonwood Springs ain't exactly brimming with opportunities for a single woman. I'm not asking anything improper. You'll have your own room until we know each other better. If after a season you find you can't abide me, I'll pay your fare back east." The preacher frowned. "Henry, perhaps Miss Haywood needs time to—" "Time is what I don't have, Reverend," Beatrice said, surprising herself with her own words. "My accommodations at the boarding house will only last a week." She turned to Henry Foster, studying him with newfound resolution. "Mr. Foster, are you certain about this offer?" "Yes, madam, I am." His gaze was steady, unwavering. "And you'll honor your word about separate accommodations until we're better acquainted?" "You have my solemn oath." Beatrice took a deep breath. The practical part of her mind, the part that had survived after losing both parents and being shunned by her remaining family, recognized this might be her only chance. She'd come west for a new beginning. And while this wasn't how she'd imagined it, perhaps Providence had intervened in its own mysterious way. "Very well, Mr. Foster. I accept your proposal." A murmur ran through the small crowd that remained. The preacher looked between them with concern. "Are you absolutely certain, Miss Haywood?" Beatrice nodded, her chin lifting with newfound determination. "I am." The ceremony that followed was brief and simple. Henry's hands were warm and steady as he slid his mother's ring onto Beatrice's finger. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss, just a respectful nod from her new husband and a gentle squeeze of her hand. Outside the church, Henry helped Beatrice into his wagon. "We should collect your belongings from the boarding house before heading to the ranch," he said, settling beside her on the wooden seat. As they drove down the main street of Cottonwood Springs, Beatrice felt the eyes of the townsfolk following them. She sat stiffly, her wedding bouquet still clutched in her hands, wondering what madness had possessed her to marry a man she'd known for less than an hour. "I expect you have questions," Henry said, as they left the town behind and headed out onto the open prairie. "Several hundred," Beatrice replied with unexpected candor, which drew a chuckle from her new husband. "Fair enough. Why don't we start with the most pressing ones?" Beatrice considered this. "How did you know my name?" "Small towns have few secrets, Miss Haywood, Mrs. Foster, I should say." "Everyone's been talking about Maxwell Richardson's mail-order bride arriving on yesterday's stage. I was in town picking up supplies when I heard about the wedding." "And what made you decide to offer marriage to a woman you'd never met?" Henry was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins. "I've been alone too long. My parents passed 5 years ago, within months of each other. I inherited the ranch and have been working it by myself with just a couple of hands. It's a good piece of land, but a house needs a woman's touch to make it a home." He glanced at her. "I reckon you needed a husband, and I needed a wife." Seemed like a sensible arrangement. "Sensible," Beatrice echoed, not entirely sure if she found his pragmatism refreshing or disturbing. "I know it's not romantic," Henry added, seeming to sense her thoughts. "But I promise to be a good husband. I won't drink to excess or raise a hand to you. The ranch has been profitable these last few years. You won't want for anything I can provide." They rode in silence for several minutes, the rhythmic creaking of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of hooves filling the space between them. "I should warn you," Beatrice finally said, "I know very little about ranch life. I was raised in Boston. My father was a bookkeeper." "I figured as much from your accent and those city boots," Henry replied without judgment. "Ranch life can be learned. It's character that matters out here, and you've shown plenty of that today." At the boarding house, Beatrice changed out of her wedding dress while Henry loaded her trunks onto the wagon. She chose a practical blue traveling dress, pinning her hair up beneath a modest bonnet. As she descended the stairs, she overheard the boarding house owner, Mrs. Bellamy, speaking to Henry. "That poor girl traveled all this way just to be humiliated. It's a Christian thing you're doing, Henry Foster, though Lord knows what people will say." "People always find something to say, Mrs. Bellamy. I reckon they can talk all they want while I'm busy building a life." Beatrice's heart warmed slightly at his response. Whatever his reasons, Henry Foster seemed to be a man of principle. The journey to the Double F Ranch took nearly 3 hours. As they traveled, the landscape changed from prairie to rolling hills dotted with pines. Beatrice was struck by the vastness of the country, so different from the crowded streets of Boston. "It's beautiful," she murmured as they crested a hill, and she caught her first glimpse of a herd of antelope in the distance. "It grows on you," Henry agreed. "First time I saw Wyoming, I thought it was too big, too empty. Now, I can't imagine living anywhere else." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they turned onto a long dirt road marked by a wooden arch bearing the Double F brand. In the distance, Beatrice could make out a substantial log home with a broad porch, several outbuildings, and corrals containing horses. "Welcome home, Mrs. Foster," Henry said quietly. The word sent an unexpected shiver down Beatrice's spine. Home. After months of uncertainty, the concept seemed both foreign and desperately needed. As they approached the ranch house, 2 men emerged from one of the outbuildings. They watched the wagon with undisguised curiosity. "That's Elijah and Tom, my ranch hands," Henry explained. "Good men. Elijah's been with the family since before I was born." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, coming around to offer Beatrice his hand. She hesitated only briefly before accepting his assistance, acutely aware that she was about to begin her life as the mistress of a ranch she'd never seen, married to a man she barely knew. "Boss," the older of the 2 men called out, approaching with a puzzled expression. "Didn't expect you back so soon, and with—" He trailed off, looking at Beatrice with undisguised surprise. "Elijah, Tom, I'd like you to meet my wife, Beatrice Foster," Henry said with a calm authority that surprised her. Both men's jaws dropped in perfect unison. "You're what now?" the younger man, Tom, blurted out. "My wife," Henry repeated. "We were married in town today." Elijah, a weather-beaten man with gray-streaked hair, recovered first. He removed his hat and gave Beatrice a respectful nod. "Madam, welcome to the Double F. We weren't aware the boss was courting anyone. It was a somewhat accelerated courtship," Beatrice replied, finding her voice. Henry placed a protective hand at the small of her back. "Mrs. Foster has had a long journey. I'm going to show her the house and get her settled. Tom, would you see to the horses? Elijah, could you bring Mrs. Foster's trunks inside?" As the men moved to follow his instructions, Henry guided Beatrice toward the house. Up close, she could see it was larger and more well-built than she'd initially thought. The logs were carefully fitted, the windows were actual glass, and the porch was wide and inviting with several rocking chairs. "My father built this place," Henry explained as he opened the front door. "Started with just 2 rooms and kept adding on as the ranch prospered. My mother insisted on certain refinements. Said just because we lived in the wilderness didn't mean we had to live like savages." The interior was surprisingly welcoming. The main room featured a large stone fireplace, comfortable-looking furniture, and colorful woven rugs covering portions of the wooden floor. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that made Beatrice's heart leap with unexpected joy. "You read?" she said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Henry smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married Pa. She made sure her children valued education. Not that it took much encouraging with me. Winter nights are long in Wyoming." He showed her through the rest of the house, a well-appointed kitchen with a modern cast-iron stove, a dining room with a handsome oak table that could seat 10, and 3 bedrooms upstairs. The master bedroom was large and airy, with a massive 4-poster bed covered in a handmade quilt. "This was my parents' room," Henry said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "It's yours now. I've been using the room across the hall since they passed." Beatrice's heart pounded in her ears. Despite his earlier promise, she half expected him to suggest different arrangements now that they were alone in the house. Instead, he stepped back respectfully. "The room next to this one is set up as a sitting room, but you're welcome to make any changes you see fit. This is your home now." Elijah knocked on the front door then, calling up that he'd brought her trunks. Henry excused himself to help, leaving Beatrice alone to absorb her new surroundings. She moved to the window, gazing out at the spectacular view of mountains in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow, despite the spring warmth. The land surrounding the house was well tended, with a kitchen garden visible to one side and flowering shrubs planted near the porch. Someone Henry's mother presumably had cared about making this remote place beautiful. When Henry returned upstairs, he carried her largest trunk as if it weighed nothing. "Where would you like this?" "Here is fine, thank you." Beatrice smoothed her skirts nervously. "Mr. Foster." "Henry, please. Seems a bit formal to use surnames when we're married." "Henry?" she amended, the name feeling strange on her tongue. "I want to thank you for your kindness today. I don't know what would have become of me if you hadn't." She trailed off, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. Henry set the trunk down gently and stood facing her, keeping a respectful distance. "No need for thanks. I meant what I said in town. This arrangement can benefit us both, if we're willing to give it a chance." He hesitated, then added, "I know this isn't the marriage you envisioned when you came west, Beatrice. I'm not asking for anything but a chance to prove that it could be a good one, in time." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her. "I appreciate that, and I intend to be a good wife, to contribute to this household in whatever ways I can." "I'm sure you will." He moved toward the door. "You must be tired. I'll leave you to rest and get settled. Supper's usually at 6, but we can delay it if you need more time." "6 will be fine," Beatrice assured him, suddenly realizing she was indeed exhausted. After Henry left, she sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to process the whirlwind day. That morning, she had been Beatrice Haywood, mail-order bride to a man she knew only through letters. Now, she was Beatrice Foster, wife to a rancher who was a complete stranger, mistress of a substantial home in the Wyoming wilderness. She should be terrified. Instead, she felt a curious sense of relief. Henry Foster seemed to be an honorable man. His home was comfortable, even refined in some ways. He had made no inappropriate demands and had treated her with nothing but respect. Perhaps in time, they could build something genuine from this hasty arrangement. With that hopeful thought, Beatrice began unpacking her belongings, determined to face this new chapter of her life with the same courage that had brought her west in the first place. The next morning, Beatrice woke to unfamiliar sounds, roosters crowing, cattle lowing in the distance, and the muffled voices of men already at work despite the early hour. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then yesterday's events came flooding back, and she sat up quickly. She was married to a stranger, and this was her first day as the mistress of a ranch. Beatrice dressed carefully in one of her simpler dresses, a practical brown calico with white trim. She brushed and pinned her chestnut hair into a modest bun, studying her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. Her hazel eyes looked larger than usual, betraying her nervousness. "You can do this," she told her reflection firmly. "You've faced worse challenges." Downstairs, she found Henry at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a ledger book. He rose immediately when she entered. "Good morning," he said, seeming almost as awkward as she felt. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, thank you," she replied, though in truth she'd spent half the night staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake or a providential decision. "I hope I'm not late for breakfast." "Not at all. The men ate earlier before heading out to mend fences in the north pasture." He gestured to the stove. "Coffee's hot. I'm afraid breakfast is rather simple when it's just me. Usually just coffee and whatever's left from the night before." Beatrice nodded, moving to the stove with newfound purpose. "Well, that will change starting today. If you'll show me what supplies we have, I'll prepare a proper breakfast." Henry's eyes widened slightly, then crinkled with pleasure. "You cook?" "I do, though I should warn you my experience is limited to city kitchens. I've never cooked on a ranch before." She poured herself a cup of coffee, surprised to find it well made and strong. "Cooking's cooking, I expect," Henry replied, closing his ledger. "The pantry's through that door. Mrs. Wilkins from town comes once a month to help with the big baking bread, pies, that sort of thing, and we smoke our own meat. The root cellar's out back. Still has plenty from last fall's harvest." Beatrice explored the well-stocked pantry, finding flour, sugar, salt, coffee, and various dried goods. The kitchen itself was thoughtfully arranged with copper pots hanging from a rack and good-quality utensils. Henry's mother's influence, no doubt. "Do you have chickens?" she asked, emerging from the pantry. "Yes, about 2 dozen. Coop's behind the smokehouse." "Perfect. I'll just collect some eggs then." Henry stood quickly. "I can show you where—" "I'm sure I can find it," Beatrice interrupted gently. "You have work to do, and I should learn my way around, unless the chickens are particularly ferocious." That drew a genuine laugh from him, transforming his serious face. "Not ferocious, no, though old Matilda might give you a peck if you reach under her wrong." By the time Beatrice returned with half a dozen fresh eggs, she had also explored the immediate surroundings of the house. The ranch was even more impressive by daylight orderly, well-maintained, with clear signs of prosperity. A far cry from the primitive frontier existence she'd braced herself for when agreeing to become a mail-order bride. She prepared a simple but hearty breakfast of scrambled eggs, bacon, and biscuits. Henry watched with undisguised appreciation as she moved around the kitchen, his presence simultaneously making her nervous and pleased. "This is wonderful," he said after taking his first bite. "I haven't had a breakfast like this since Mother passed. I'm glad you're enjoying it. I hope to improve as I learn what you like." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Henry spoke again. "I thought I might show you around the ranch today if you're feeling up to it. There's a lot to see." "I'd like that very much," Beatrice replied, genuinely interested. After breakfast, Henry saddled 2 horses, his own sturdy gelding, and a gentle mare for Beatrice. "Do you ride?" he asked, helping her mount. "A little," she admitted. "We occasionally rode in the park in Boston, but nothing like this." She gestured to the wide open spaces surrounding them. "Cassie's gentle as a lamb," Henry assured her, adjusting her stirrups. "Just hold the reins lightly and she'll follow my horse." The tour of the Double F Ranch took most of the morning. Henry showed her the barn, the corrals, the blacksmith's forge, and the bunkhouse where Elijah and Tom lived. They rode past fields where cattle grazed, stopping occasionally for Henry to point out landmarks or explain aspects of ranch operations. "The ranch is about 5,000 acres, he explained as they paused atop a rise overlooking a lush valley. "My father started with just 500, but he was good at spotting opportunities, added more land whenever he could." "It's beautiful," Beatrice said sincerely, taking in the sweeping vista. "And much more civilized than I expected the West to be." Henry smiled. "Parts of Wyoming are still plenty wild, but this area's been settled for a couple of decades now. The railroad coming through changed everything." As they continued their ride, Beatrice found herself relaxing, both in the saddle and in Henry's company. He was knowledgeable without being condescending, explaining ranching operations clearly when she asked questions. By the time they returned to the house for the midday meal, she felt she'd learned more about cattle ranching than she had in all her previous life combined. Over the next week, Beatrice settled into a routine at the Double F. She rose early to prepare breakfast, spent her mornings learning the household systems and experimenting with the kitchen, and often joined Henry for rides in the afternoons when his work allowed. In the evenings, she was surprised to discover that Henry enjoyed reading aloud while she sewed or mended. They were cordial to each other, even friendly at times, but maintained a careful distance. True to his word, Henry continued to sleep in his separate room across the hall. Sometimes Beatrice would hear his footsteps late at night, pacing, and wonder if he regretted his impulsive offer of marriage. On her 8th day at the ranch, Beatrice decided to bake an apple pie, using the last of the previous fall's stored apples. She was just removing it from the oven when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. Looking out the window, she saw a buggy approaching, driven by a well-dressed woman with a younger female companion. Beatrice hastily removed her apron and smoothed her hair, wondering who these visitors could be. She stepped onto the porch just as the buggy came to a stop. "Good afternoon," she called, smiling despite her nervousness. The older woman, elegantly dressed in a traveling suit that was fashionable without being ostentatious, surveyed Beatrice with undisguised curiosity. "Well, it seems the rumors are true," she said, climbing down from the buggy without waiting for assistance. "Henry Foster has indeed taken a wife." The younger woman, perhaps 17 or 18, followed, her expression openly friendly. "Hello, I'm Lily Patterson, and this is my mother, Mrs. Josephine Patterson. We're your neighbors from the Circle P Ranch, about 5 miles east." "It's a pleasure to meet you both," Beatrice replied, descending the steps. "I'm Beatrice Foster." "We know exactly who you are, my dear," Mrs. Patterson said, removing her gloves. "News travels fast in these parts. The entire county is talking about how Henry Foster swept in and married Maxwell Richardson's abandoned bride right in the church." Beatrice felt her cheeks grow warm. "I see the story has preceded me." "Oh, don't be embarrassed," Lily said quickly. "Everyone thinks it was terribly romantic of Mr. Foster, and nobody liked that awful Maxwell Richardson anyway. He's gone through 3 foremen in 2 years, and they say he cheats at cards." "Lily, please," her mother admonished, though without much force. She turned back to Beatrice. "We've come to welcome you to the neighborhood, Mrs. Foster, and perhaps to satisfy our curiosity, I admit. Henry has been our neighbor for years, but he's always been rather reserved. This sudden marriage took everyone by surprise." "Us most of all," Beatrice said with a small smile. "Won't you come inside? I've just baked an apple pie." Over tea and warm pie, Beatrice found herself genuinely enjoying her visitor's company. Josephine Patterson was direct but kind, and her daughter Lily was a bright, talkative girl who clearly idolized her mother. "How are you finding ranch life?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "I understand you're from back east?" "Boston," Beatrice confirmed. "It's certainly different, but I'm adjusting. Henry has been very patient with my city ignorance." "Henry Foster is a good man," Mrs. Patterson said with approval. "His parents raised him right. When Jacob and I first moved here 15 years ago, the Fosters were the only neighbors who made us feel welcome. Henry couldn't have been more than 15 then, but he was already working the ranch like a grown man. Lily leaned forward eagerly. Was it truly love at first sight? Is that why you married him so quickly? Lily, her mother scolded. Beatrice felt her face flush again. Our marriage was unexpected, she said carefully. But Henry offered me protection and a home when I had neither, and for that I'll always be grateful. Mrs. Patterson studied her thoughtfully. Well, however it came about, I'm glad to see the double F with a mistress again. This house was always meant for family. She set down her teacup decisively. Now then, you must come to dinner at the Circle P next week. Our ranch isn't as large as the double F, but we pride ourselves on our hospitality. Jacob will want to meet you, and it will give you a chance to meet some of the other neighbors. By the time the Pattersons departed, Beatrice felt she'd made her first friends in Wyoming. Their visit had also given her a new perspective on Henry. Hearing Mrs. Patterson speak of him with such respect and affection made her curious to know more about the man she'd married. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of pink and gold, Beatrice found the courage to ask more personal questions. Mrs. Patterson mentioned today that you were only 15 when they moved to their ranch, but already working like a man. Henry nodded, his gaze on the horizon. My older brother Daniel was killed in a riding accident the year before. He was 18, being groomed to take over the ranch someday. With him gone, I had to grow up fast. I'm so sorry, Beatrice said softly. I didn't know you had a brother. There's a lot we don't know about each other yet, Henry replied, his tone gentle rather than accusatory. Daniel was a natural with horses, much better than me. The irony is that it was a horse that killed him a Mustang he was trying to break. He was thrown and hit his head on a rock. He paused, his expression distant. My father was never quite the same after that. Beatrice hesitated, then asked, And your mother, Mrs.? Patterson spoke highly of her, too. My mother was the strongest person I've ever known, Henry said, his voice warming. She came west as a bride, just like you, leaving behind a comfortable life in St. Louis. She built this house alongside my father, taught school to the ranch children, including me and Daniel, and never complained even during the hardest times. He smiled faintly. She would have liked you. What was her name? Elizabeth, Henry replied, though everyone called her Ellie. And she taught you to love books, Beatrice observed, remembering the well-stocked shelves in the main room. She did. Said a man's mind needed cultivation as much as his land. He turned to look at her directly. What about your family? You mentioned your father was a bookkeeper? Beatrice nodded, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as the evening air cooled. Yes, for a shipping company. He was good with figures, but poor with money, I'm afraid. When my mother died of influenza 5 years ago, we discovered she'd been the one keeping the household solvent all along. Father remarried within a year, a widow with 2 young sons of her own. Patricia made it clear there wasn't room in the house or the budget for me. She tried to keep the bitterness from her voice. When I saw Maxwell Richardson's advertisement for a bride, it seemed like Providence. Until it wasn't, Henry said quietly. Until it wasn't, she agreed. Though perhaps Providence had a different plan all along. Their eyes met and held for a long moment. Something shifted in the air between them, not quite intimate, but warmer, more personal than before. For the first time, Beatrice felt a flutter of something beyond gratitude toward this serious, thoughtful man who'd rescued her. The dinner at the Patterson Ranch the following week proved to be a turning point in Beatrice's adjustment to her new life. Jacob Patterson, a jovial man with a booming laugh, welcomed her warmly. Several other neighboring families were also present, all curious about Henry Foster's surprise bride. To Beatrice's relief, no one made her feel uncomfortable about the circumstances of her marriage. Instead, they seemed genuinely pleased to see Henry with a wife. She overheard one elderly rancher comment to his wife, "About time that boy had someone to come home to. Been alone too long." The women were particularly welcoming, eager to include Beatrice in their conversation about household matters, local events, and the upcoming county fair. By the end of the evening, she had invitations to join the quilting circle that met monthly and had promised to contribute baked goods to the church social in June. On the ride home, Beatrice found herself chattering excitedly about her new acquaintances. Henry listened with a small smile, clearly pleased by her enthusiasm. "The Pattersons seem like wonderful people," she said as they neared the ranch. "And Mrs. Evans invited me to the quilting circle. I've never quilted before, but she said they'd teach me." "My mother was part of that group," Henry commented. "Some of her quilts are still on our beds. She always said those gatherings were as much about news and friendship as they were about sewing." Lily Patterson mentioned a county fair coming up in August. "Is it a big event?" Henry nodded. "The biggest of the year. Everyone for 50 miles attends. There are competitions for livestock, crops, handicrafts. My father used to show his prize bulls, and Mother always entered her preserves and quilts." He glanced at her. "You should consider entering something. Your apple pie would give Mrs. Sullivan a run for her money, and she's won the baking category 3 years running." Beatrice laughed, feeling a strange mixture of pride and anxiety at the suggestion. "I don't know if I'm ready to compete with established ranch wives." "You might surprise yourself," Henry said quietly. "You've taken to ranch life more naturally than anyone would expect from a Boston City girl." His unexpected compliment warmed her more than it should have. As May turned to June, the ranch grew busier with summer activities. Beatrice found herself fully occupied with household management, gardening, and learning new skills. Mrs. Wilkins, who had been helping with the baking, showed her how to make soap from rendered fat and lye, a messy but satisfying process. Elijah's wife Martha, who lived in town but visited regularly, taught her to preserve early summer berries and vegetables. The rhythm of ranch life began to feel natural. Beatrice rose with the sun, prepared breakfast for Henry and sometimes the ranch hands, tended her expanding kitchen garden, and managed the household accounts with the meticulous attention to detail her father had instilled in her. She found unexpected joy in these simple, productive days. Her relationship with Henry evolved gradually. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. They discovered shared interests in literature and music. Beatrice unearthed an old piano in one of the storage rooms, and though it needed tuning badly, she was delighted to find that her years of lessons hadn't been forgotten. Henry confessed that he'd always wanted to learn, but never had the time. "Perhaps I could teach you," she offered one evening after playing a simple melody. "I have rather large hands for piano keys," he demurred, holding them up to demonstrate. "Nonsense. Some of the greatest pianists were men with large hands. It gives you an advantage for reaching the octaves." Before she could reconsider, Beatrice took his hand and placed it on the keys. "See? Your fingers can easily span 8 notes." The moment her hand touched his, something electric passed between them. Henry went very still, his eyes fixed on their joined hands. Beatrice felt her heart begin to race, suddenly acutely aware of his physical presence beside her on the piano bench. She withdrew her hand quickly. "Perhaps another time," she murmured, rising from the bench. "Perhaps," Henry agreed, his voice husky. That night, lying in her bed across the hall from his, Beatrice found herself thinking about her husband in a way she hadn't before. She'd been grateful to him, respectful of him, and increasingly fond of him. But now she was becoming aware of him as a man, his tall, strong frame, his gentle hands, the way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he smiled. It was confusing and thrilling all at once. She'd come to Wyoming prepared to be a wife in every sense to Maxwell Richardson, a man she'd known only through letters. But the prospect of physical intimacy with Henry Foster, a man she was coming to know and respect deeply, both frightened and intrigued her. June brought the church social Mrs. Evans had mentioned. Beatrice spent the day before baking cherry pies from the fruit of the tree behind the house. Henry watched her work, sampling the filling when she offered him a spoonful. "These will be the most popular desserts at the social," he predicted. "You have a gift for baking." "My mother taught me," Beatrice replied, pleased by his praise. "She said a woman who could bake a perfect pie could accomplish anything." "Wise woman," Henry said with a smile, "though I suspect your talents go far beyond pie making." The social was held on the church grounds, with tables set up under the cottonwood trees. Nearly everyone Beatrice had met at the Pattersons' dinner was there, along with many others from farther-flung ranches and farms. To her delight, her pies were indeed popular, with several people requesting her recipe. "Told you," Henry murmured in her ear as they watched the last slice being claimed. His closeness sent a shiver down her spine. Later, as fiddle music started up and couples began to dance on a wooden platform erected for the occasion. Henry hesitantly offered his hand. "Would you care to dance, Mrs. Foster?" Beatrice took his hand, allowing him to lead her onto the floor. "I should warn you, I'm more familiar with formal ballroom dances than country reels." "Then we'll learn together," Henry replied, placing his hand respectfully at her waist. The dance was lively, requiring them to circle, separate, and come together again. Beatrice found herself laughing as Henry twirled her, their movements becoming more synchronized as they learned the steps. When the music finally ended, they were both breathless and smiling. "You're a natural," Henry said, his hand still holding hers. "Or perhaps I just have a good partner," Beatrice replied, feeling bold. Something in Henry's expression changed, becoming more intense. For a breathless moment, Beatrice thought he might kiss her right there in front of everyone. Instead, he gave her hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. "Would you like some punch?" he asked, his voice slightly rough. "Yes, thank you," she replied, feeling simultaneously disappointed and relieved. As Henry went to fetch their drinks, Josephine Patterson appeared at Beatrice's side. "You two make a handsome couple," she observed, "and Henry seems happier than I've seen him in years." "Do you think so?" Beatrice asked, her gaze following her husband through the crowd. "I know so. That man has carried too much on his shoulders since his parents passed. It's good to see him smiling again." Mrs. Patterson patted Beatrice's arm. "Whatever brought you two together, it was a blessing." The ride home that evening was quiet but comfortable. Beatrice found herself increasingly aware of Henry beside her on the wagon seat, the occasional brush of his arm against hers sending ripples of awareness through her. When they reached the ranch, he helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for coming with me today," he said softly. "I enjoyed it more than any social in recent memory." "So did I," Beatrice admitted, looking up at him in the moonlight. "Henry, But whatever she might have said was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Henry turned, his body tensing as a rider came into view. "Who's there?" he called, stepping slightly in front of Beatrice. "It's Elijah, boss," came the reply. "Sorry to disturb you so late, but we've got trouble. Rustlers hit the north pasture. Tom's trailing them, but they've got at least 20 head." Henry's expression hardened. "I'll get my rifle. We'll go after them." Beatrice felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. "Isn't that dangerous?" "Can't let them get away with stealing our cattle," Henry replied grimly. He turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Don't worry, this happens occasionally. We'll get the cattle back." "Be careful," she urged as he hurried toward the house. He paused, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I will." Beatrice watched anxiously as Henry and Elijah rode out, their figures soon swallowed by the darkness. She went inside, lit lamps in the windows to guide their return, and then sat in Henry's chair by the fireplace to wait. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Beatrice tried to read, but couldn't focus on the words. She made coffee, knowing they'd need it when they returned. Twice she went to the porch, straining to hear any sound of approaching riders, but the night remained still, except for the usual chorus of crickets and distant coyotes. It was nearly dawn when she finally heard hoofbeats. Rushing to the door, she saw 3 riders approaching Henry, Elijah, and Tom, driving a small herd of cattle before them. Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her knees weak. Henry dismounted stiffly, his face etched with exhaustion but triumphant. "We got them back," he said, as Beatrice ran down the steps toward him. "Caught up to the rustlers near the river. They scattered when they saw us coming." "You're not hurt?" she asked, her eyes scanning him anxiously. "Not a scratch," he assured her, "though I'm too old to spend all night in the saddle anymore. I'll be feeling it tomorrow." Without thinking, Beatrice threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly. "I was so worried." Henry froze for an instant, then his arms came around her, holding her against him. "I'm sorry to have caused you concern," he murmured into her hair. It was the first time they had embraced, and Beatrice was acutely aware of his solid warmth, the beat of his heart against her cheek. She pulled back reluctantly, suddenly self-conscious about her display of emotion. "I made coffee," she said, her voice unsteady. "And there's stew left from supper." Henry smiled down at her, his expression tender. That sounds perfect. As June turned to July, the heat of summer settled over the Wyoming plains. Ranch work intensified with haying, cattle branding, and preparations for the fall roundup. Henry often came in late, tired and sunburned, but he never failed to thank Beatrice for the meals she prepared or show interest in her day. Their relationship continued to deepen. Moving beyond cordial roommates to genuine friends, they shared stories of their childhoods, discovered common interests, and occasionally argued usually good-naturedly about books or politics. Beatrice found herself looking forward to their evenings together, when they would sit on the porch watching the sun set or read aloud to each other in the main room. Physical awareness hummed between them, though neither acted on it. Sometimes Beatrice would catch Henry watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Other times, she found herself admiring the way his shoulders filled out his shirt, or how his hands, rough from work but always gentle with her, handled tools or animals with such competence. In mid-July, Henry announced at breakfast that he needed to ride to Laramie for supplies and to sell some cattle. "I'll be gone 3 days, possibly 4, he said apologetically. "Will you be all right here? Elijah and Tom will keep an eye on things, and Martha has offered to stay with you if you'd prefer not to be alone." "I'll be fine," Beatrice assured him, though the thought of his absence created an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. "The house is secure, and I have plenty to keep me occupied." Henry nodded, but she could see concern in his eyes. "I don't like leaving you so soon after those rustlers were in the area. They're long gone," she reminded him, "and as you said, Elijah and Tom will be here." The morning of Henry's departure, Beatrice rose early to prepare a hearty breakfast and pack food for his journey. As he prepared to mount his horse, she handed him the carefully wrapped provisions. "Thank you," he said, their fingers brushing as he took the package. He hesitated, then added, "I'll miss you." It was the most direct expression of personal feeling he'd offered since their marriage. Beatrice felt a flush of pleasure rise to her cheeks. "I'll miss you too," she admitted. "Be safe." Henry's eyes held hers for a long moment. Then, in a movement so quick she had no time to react, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a brief, gentle kiss. Before she could respond, he was in the saddle and riding away, leaving Beatrice standing in the yard with her fingers pressed to her lips in wonder. The days of Henry's absence dragged by with unexpected loneliness. Beatrice kept busy with household tasks, but the house felt too quiet without his presence. She realized with some surprise how accustomed she'd grown to his company, how much she looked forward to sharing her thoughts with him each evening. On the afternoon of the 4th day, dark clouds began gathering on the horizon. Elijah appeared at the kitchen door, his weathered face concerned. "Storm's coming, Mrs. Foster. Looks to be a big one. Tom and I are going to secure the livestock and outbuildings. You might want to bring in extra firewood and fill some water buckets just in case." Beatrice nodded, glancing anxiously toward the road. "Do you think Henry will make it back before the storm hits?" Elijah followed her gaze. "Hard to say, madam. If he left Laramie early this morning, he might. But if he hasn't reached the valley by now, he'd be wise to find shelter and wait it out." The thought of Henry caught in a storm on the open plains made Beatrice's stomach clench with worry. She busied herself with preparations, bringing in firewood, filling water containers, and making sure the lamps were filled with oil in case the storm lasted into the night. By late afternoon, the sky had turned an ominous greenish black. Wind whipped through the yard, sending dust and leaves swirling. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Beatrice could see flashes of lightning illuminating the clouds. As the first heavy raindrops began to fall, she stood on the porch, straining to see through the gathering darkness. There was no sign of Henry. The storm broke with stunning ferocity. Rain pounded the roof like 1,000 hammers, while lightning split the sky and thunder shook the house to its foundations. Beatrice paced anxiously, alternating between windows, hoping for some glimpse of a rider through the deluge. As dusk deepened into full night, she reluctantly conceded that Henry wouldn't be returning until the storm passed. She tried to comfort herself with the thought that he was too experienced to risk traveling in such conditions. Surely he had found shelter somewhere along the road. Beatrice lit the lamps, built up the fire, and settled into Henry's chair with a book she couldn't focus on. The storm showed no signs of abating, with rain now driving horizontally against the windows and wind howling around the eaves like a living thing. Just as she was considering retiring to bed, despite knowing sleep would elude her, Beatrice heard a sound at the door. She froze, listening intently. There it was again, a faint knocking barely audible above the storm's fury. She rushed to the door and threw it open to find Henry on the threshold, soaked to the skin and swaying with exhaustion. "Henry!" she cried, pulling him inside. "Thank God you're safe." He stumbled slightly as he entered, and she could feel him trembling beneath her hands. "Sorry I'm late," he managed, his voice hoarse. "Tried to outrun the storm. Bad decision." "You're freezing," Beatrice said, helping him remove his sodden coat. "We need to get you warm and dry immediately." Working quickly, she built up the fire, heated water, and gathered dry clothes and blankets. Henry was so chilled he could barely unfasten his own buttons, so Beatrice hesitantly helped him, trying to maintain his dignity while getting him out of his wet clothing as efficiently as possible. Once he was changed into dry clothes and wrapped in blankets before the fire, she brought him hot coffee laced with whiskey. "Drink this," she ordered. "Then I'll make you something to eat." Henry obeyed, his hand still shaking slightly as he lifted the cup. "Never seen a storm blow up so fast," he said between sips. "Was halfway across the valley when it hit. Could barely see my hand in front of my face, let alone the trail." Beatrice perched on the arm of his chair, unable to stop herself from touching his shoulder, his hair, reassuring herself that he was really there and safe. "You should have found shelter and waited." "Wanted to get home," he said simply, looking up at her with an expression that made her heart skip a beat. "To you." Something shifted between them in that moment, a barrier falling away, a decision made without words. Beatrice felt it like a physical change in the air, electric and inevitable. She made him a simple meal of stew and bread, which he ate ravenously. The color gradually returned to his face, and his shivering subsided. When he had finished eating, she took his bowl and turned to carry it to the kitchen. Henry caught her hand. "Beatrice!" She turned back to him, her pulse quickening at the look in his eyes. "Yes? Thank you for caring for me tonight, for waiting up, for worrying." He rose from his chair, still holding her hand, bringing them face to face. "Of course I worried," she said softly. "You're my husband." "In name only, until now," he replied, his voice low and serious. "But I've come to care for you as more than a convenient arrangement, more than a friend or companion." He lifted his free hand to touch her cheek gently. I hope, you might feel the same." Beatrice leaned slightly into his touch. "I do," she whispered. "I didn't expect to, but I do." Henry's eyes darkened. Slowly giving her every opportunity to pull away, he lowered his mouth to hers. Unlike the brief, chaste kiss before his departure, this one was deep and searching, a question and an answer all at once. Beatrice responded with an eagerness that surprised them both, her arms sliding around his neck as his encircled her waist, drawing her closer. The bowl she'd been holding clattered to the floor, forgotten. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "I should have asked before I left," Henry murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "Asked if you were ready for this to be a real marriage in every sense. If you needed more time." Beatrice silenced him with another kiss. "I don't need more time," she assured him. "I know my own heart, Henry Foster." Later, as they lay entwined in what was now truly their marriage bed, the storm still raging outside, Beatrice marveled at the strange turns life could take. 3 months ago, she had been abandoned at the altar, her future uncertain and frightening. Now she was in the arms of a man she had come to love deeply, a man whose strength and gentleness had won her heart completely. "What are you thinking?" Henry asked, his voice drowsy as he stroked her hair. "That being left at the church was the best thing that ever happened to me," she replied honestly, "because it led me to you." Henry tightened his arms around her. "I knew the moment I saw you standing there in your wedding dress, looking so brave despite everything, that you were someone special. I didn't plan to offer marriage, the words just came out. And I didn't plan to accept," Beatrice said with a small laugh. "But something told me to trust you." "I'm glad you did," he murmured, kissing her temple. "And I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." As summer gave way to autumn, Beatrice and Henry settled into their new relationship with joy and occasional wonder. They worked side by side during the days, Beatrice managing the household and garden, learning to ride better, even helping with some of the lighter ranch work, while Henry continued to build the Double F into one of the most prosperous ranches in the county. At night, they shared the intimacy they'd denied themselves for months, discovering each other's bodies with the same care and attention they'd given to learning each other's minds and hearts. Beatrice, who had approached her original mail-order marriage with practical resignation, found herself falling more deeply in love with Henry each day. The county fair in August was everything Henry had promised. Beatrice entered her cherry preserves and an apple pie in the competitions, winning a blue ribbon for the preserves and a red for the pie. She pretended outrage when Mrs. Sullivan's peach cobbler took the blue ribbon in baking. Next year, she vowed as they rode home, her ribbons carefully preserved in her basket. Next year, I'll have had a full season to perfect my recipes. Henry smiled at her determination. I have no doubt you'll sweep every category you enter, he said. You're the most capable woman I've ever known. Beatrice Foster. In September, Beatrice began to suspect she was with child. The subtle changes in her body, the unexpected fatigue, the slight nausea in the mornings, all pointed to the new life growing within her. She waited until she was certain before sharing the news with Henry. They were sitting on the porch one evening in early October, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air had turned crisp, and Henry had wrapped a blanket around them both. I have something to tell you, Beatrice said, nestling against his side. Henry was half dozing, content and relaxed after a long day's work. We're going to have a baby. In the spring. Henry went completely still. Then he turned to look at her, his eyes wide with wonder. A baby? You're sure? Beatrice nodded, suddenly nervous about his reaction. Pretty sure. All the signs are there. I think it happened during that storm, when you came home so late. Her words were cut off as Henry pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious porcelain. A baby, he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. Our baby. You're pleased then? She asked, though his reaction had already answered her question. Pleased? Beatrice, He struggled to find the words, then gave up and kissed her instead, pouring all his joy and love into the gesture. When they finally parted, Beatrice saw tears in his eyes. I never thought I'd have this, he admitted quietly. A wife I adore, a child on the way. After my parents died, I focused on keeping the ranch going, never allowed myself to think beyond that. And now, she prompted, stroking his cheek, now I can't imagine my life any other way. He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. Our family. Something my parents always wanted for me. Something I'd given up hoping for. As the months passed and Beatrice's pregnancy progressed, their happiness only grew. Henry was attentive to her every need, insisting she rest more and hiring additional help for the house so she wouldn't overtax herself. Beatrice alternated between appreciation for his concern and amused exasperation when his protectiveness became excessive. I'm carrying a child, Henry, not made of glass, she reminded him one day when he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of laundry. Humor me, he replied, taking the basket from her hands. My mother always said my father nearly drove her to distraction when she was expecting Daniel and me. It seems to be a family tradition. Winter settled over Wyoming with its usual severity, but the Foster home remained warm and bright. They celebrated Christmas with a small gathering of neighbors, including the Pattersons, who had become their closest friends. Josephine Patterson brought baby clothes she'd knitted herself, while her daughter Lily presented Beatrice with a beautiful handmade quilt for the cradle Henry was constructing in his workshop. You've brought life back to this house, Josephine told Beatrice privately as they prepared coffee and dessert in the kitchen. Henry was existing, not living, before you came. Now look at him. Beatrice glanced through the doorway to where Henry stood, talking with Jacob Patterson, his face animated as he described his plans for spring planting. He caught her looking and smiled, a private smile just for her that still had the power to make her heart race. I'm the fortunate one, Beatrice replied honestly. I came west expecting a practical arrangement with a stranger. Instead, I found love with the best man I've ever known. Their son was born on a bright April morning in 1877, almost exactly a year after Beatrice had been left at the church in Cottonwood Springs. After a night of labor supported by Henry's steady presence and Martha's experienced midwifery, their child entered the world with a lusty cry that immediately captured his father's heart. "He's perfect," Henry whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he held his son for the first time. Beautiful and strong, just like his mother. They named him Daniel Jacob Foster, honoring both Henry's brother and their good friend, Jacob Patterson. As Beatrice watched Henry cradle their son, his big hands incredibly gentle with the tiny bundle, she felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it?" Henry asked, noticing her tears. "I was just thinking how strangely life works out," she replied, reaching to touch his arm. "If Maxwell Richardson hadn't abandoned me that day, I would never have found you, never had this." Henry leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Then I believe I owe Mr. Richardson a debt of gratitude, though I'd never tell him so." "Whatever became of him?" Beatrice wondered. "I never asked. Last I heard, he'd moved on to Colorado after his ranch failed. Bad management, bad debts." Henry shook his head. "His loss was my immeasurable gain." As spring blossomed into summer again, the Double F Ranch thrived along with the Foster family. Beatrice recovered quickly from childbirth and resumed her role as the capable mistress of the ranch, now with baby Daniel as her constant companion. Henry expanded their cattle operation, adding new breeding stock and increasing their holdings with the purchase of adjacent land. On their first wedding anniversary, Henry surprised Beatrice with a small, intricately carved wooden box. Inside lay a beautiful gold locket. "Open it," he urged when she gazed at it in wonder. Inside were two tiny photographs, one of Henry and one of baby Daniel. Beatrice felt tears well in her eyes as Henry fastened the chain around her neck. "I want you to always have us close to your heart," he said, "though I hope we'll never be far from your side." "Never," she promised, reaching up to kiss him. "My heart is forever here, with you and Daniel, on this land we both love." Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge while their son slept peacefully inside, Henry took Beatrice's hand. "I've been thinking," he said thoughtfully. "A dangerous pastime," she teased, leaning against his shoulder. He chuckled. "Perhaps. But I've been thinking about us, about how we began. You never really had a proper courtship, or even a proposal. I don't need those things, Henry. I have everything I could want. Nonetheless," he continued, turning to face her fully, "I find myself wanting to do this properly, at least once." To her surprise, he slid from the porch swing to one knee before her, still holding her hand. "Beatrice Haywood Foster, although we did things in a rather unconventional order, would you do me the honor of remaining my wife for all the days of our lives, of continuing to build this family and this ranch with me, of growing old beside me?" Beatrice felt her heart swell with emotion. "Yes," she whispered, 1,000 times, yes. Henry's smile was radiant as he rose to kiss her, a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. 10 years later, the Double F Ranch had nearly doubled in size and prosperity. The main house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family. Daniel, now a sturdy 10-year-old with his father's serious nature and his mother's quick wit, had been joined by 7-year-old twins, Elizabeth and Josephine, named for Henry's mother and their dear friend, and 3-year-old James. On a warm summer evening, much like the one when Beatrice had first arrived at the ranch, she stood on the porch watching Henry teaching Daniel how to properly saddle a horse. The boy was attentive, eager to please his father and learn the skills he would need as the future master of the Double F. The twins were in the kitchen with Martha, learning to make biscuits, while little James napped upstairs after an exhausting morning of helping his father check fence lines. The ranch hands' quarters had been expanded to house the additional workers needed for the larger operation, and a small schoolhouse had been built halfway between the Double F and the Circle P to serve the children of both ranches and nearby homesteads. Beatrice's gaze drifted to the distant mountains, still capped with snow despite the summer heat. Wyoming had become home in a way Boston never had been. Here, she had found purpose, community, and a love so deep and abiding It still took her breath away at unexpected moments. Henry looked up, catching her eye across the yard. Even after all these years, that simple connection could make her heart skip. He said something to Daniel, then walked toward her, his stride confident and familiar. "What is you looking so thoughtful, Mrs. Foster?" he asked as he climbed the steps to join her. "Just counting my blessings," she replied, leaning into him as his arms circled her waist. "They're numerous." "As are mine," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Though they all begin and end with the day you agreed to marry me in that little church in Cottonwood Springs." Beatrice turned in his arms to face him. "Best decision I ever made. Even better than your decision to enter those preserves in last year's county fair," Henry teased. Her cherry preserves had finally unseated Mrs. Sullivan's long-standing reign in the category. "Even better than that," she assured him, laughing. Though it was a close call. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their oldest son master the task his father had set, their daughter's laughter drifting from the kitchen window, the land they'd nurtured stretching out around them in fertile abundance. "I love you, Beatrice Foster," Henry said softly, the words still powerful though he'd spoken them countless times over the years. "And I love you," she replied. The simple truth that had transformed an arrangement of convenience into a lifetime of joy. "Always,"